this year, the legend is reborn. Legend of Zelda.
Wind Waker was my second favorite game of all time for a couple of years. For a little bit, it was my favorite game of all time. Like a lot of people, I was going through some pretty heavy times during high school, so on the school bus, I would often just think about my favorite games and compare and contrast them and try to figure out what I liked and disliked about them. I think it was around that time that I started to develop a more analytical way of looking at games, for better or for worse. Wind Waker boosted my imagination. It made me a happier person. The visual style, the music, the overall sense of fun and adventure. It's cool that video games can even offer us something like this. Exploring a gigantic, cartoony ocean filled with cute characters and secrets is worth dozens of hours of entertainment. I did have a little experience with the GameCube version, but I never beat it, and like an idiot, I sold a lot of my old games to GameStop. I probably traded it in for some crap like Nicktoons Unite. So when the HD version came out, I beat it and then immediately beat it again on hero mode, taking double damage and also doing a 3-heart challenge at the same time. Then a few years later, I beat it again for my third time. Fast forward to today and I beat it for my fourth time about a week ago, and I just want to talk about my changing thoughts on it. It's weird having been so invested in one single game, playing it over and over and over again, and then not having played it for almost a decade. If you guys like Zelda, Nintendo, retro games, a lot of PlayStation IP, if you just like video game analysis, don't be afraid to subscribe or hit the like button, share this video with a friend, maybe comment. I keep forgetting to say all that boring YouTuber stuff at the beginning of a video, which is probably why my stats are so slowly growing. Wind Waker was the beginning of a new era for The Legend of Zelda, where they wanted you to know that Link was a person. A Link to the Past tried, I guess, with Link's dead uncle who's dead 2 minutes into the game. But Wind Waker gives you a nice 20 or so minutes with Link's grandma and adorable sister Aryll. One key example of this is Link's classic green clothes. I think Wind Waker was the first game in the Zelda series where they really decided to just fucking explain why Link has to wear green clothes. They continued to do this in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, and it's like, I get it, he's fulfilling a legend. Some things in video games don't really need explaining or backstory, but they decided to go that route here, and it's not that bad because, like I said, about 30 minutes in, the shit hits the fan and you quickly get introduced to the lovely Tetra, who's one of my favorite Zelda characters ever. For some reason, I always get kind of choked up at this scene where Link has to say goodbye to his grandma. I always get goosebumps. It makes me kind of sad. I don't know why. Link's grandma is like a very underwritten character in this game. She barely has any dialogue other than the intro of the game, but something about a kid who wakes up on a beautiful sunny day, which is also his birthday, and having his little sister kidnapped and now he has to leave home, it's kind of crazy. We're quickly brought to the Forsaken Fortress, which, listen, I know some people like to call this a dungeon, but I don't. The Forsaken Fortress is split into two halves in the beginning and the middle of the game, but both halves are so pathetically easy and fast that it's definitely not a dungeon. I beat the first half of the Forsaken Fortress in like 9 minutes, and no, I'm not making that up. I've been replaying a lot of Zelda games and kind of just timing things, and I swear to God, I put a timer on my iPhone and I beat the Forsaken Fortress in 9 minutes. It feels like they split a mini dungeon in half, and it would have been cooler if they kept you in the Forsaken Fortress for like 30 to 40 minutes and made it a full dungeon. You could have gotten the hammer early instead of in the middle of the game and then beat the Helmarok King, save Aryll, and then go out on your real quest. But instead you lose the sword you got just 5 minutes ago, and you gotta use these stealth mechanics that literally never come into use for the rest of the game. It was during this fourth playthrough that I focused on that aspect. When a game introduces a mechanic that's very rarely used after its introduction, it makes you wonder why it was put into a game at all. Is it because they just wanted to do it? Did they just want to animate it? Did they just want to model it? Did they run out of ideas for it? And if you didn't have enough ideas for a mechanic to feel useful for the duration of the game, what's really the point of it? So overall, it takes you about an hour and 15 minutes to get to the first real dungeon, Dragon Roost Cavern. Let's introduce a new term, okay? TTD, time to dungeon. This is important. Dungeons are the main meat of a Zelda game. Fighting monsters, collecting keys, pushing blocks, getting cool new items that will unlock new paths. That's why we play Zelda. That's the gameplay loop. If we didn't have the dungeons, it would be like having vegetables and mashed potatoes for dinner. There's something clearly missing on that plate. Games like Zelda 1, A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time, they do time to dungeon perfectly. You have a sword and shield in your hand like 5 minutes into the game and you're already devouring that sweet delicious meat I mentioned before, the dungeons. Okay, for you vegans out there, maybe like a Beyond Burger? Luckily, after Dragon Roost Cavern, you're in the second dungeon, Forest Haven, like 20 minutes later. Again, I was really weird during this playthrough and I was timing everything on my iPhone. Then there's this part where clearly there was supposed to be another dungeon with Jaboon, obviously being like Jabu Jabu in Ocarina of Time. Like, you'd probably get to Jaboon and he'd say something like, oh, in the rush to get away from Ganon, he accidentally swallowed the pearl and you have to go inside of him to get it. But this third dungeon was cut due to development time constraints, and the pearl you need is just given to you. This never ever happens in a Zelda game where the important end dungeon item is just given to you. As far as I remember, this is the only time in the whole series where a story related item is just barfed out to you. After getting the pearl from Jaboon, the middle of the game flows at a pretty decent pace. The Tower of Gods is great, and then the game encourages you to explore, get the fire and ice arrows, and do the remaining 2 dungeons. But once we get into the last third of the game is when we get to the Triforce quest, which is an infamous complaint with the game. Personally, I don't think it's the worst thing ever, but it definitely isn't very fun, and it feels very much like, hey, there was supposed to be another dungeon here, but we don't have enough time, so here's some boring combat arenas with our piss easy enemies and a lot of tedious exploring. Also, we wasted the ghost ship. Seriously, a lot of the Triforce pieces are hidden behind combat arenas, which of course aren't hard, we'll get to that later, so it just feels like pure padding. The worst is how there's a few Triforce pieces that you can't even find at first, so you have to get a Triforce chart, then pay Tingle a decent amount of money to read the chart, and then go find the piece. It's just a bunch of After my first playthrough of Wind Waker, I actually wrote a guide on a piece of paper and left it in the case for future me, for I guess this me. Hi Past Dylan, thank you. It was a Triforce quest guide on how to get through it really fast, and once again I timed everything on my iPhone, following the guide step by step, and it still took me just over 2 hours. So after we get the Triforce pieces, we get to go to Ganon's tower, and my memory was hazy since it's been a while. I forgot they did the whole let's reuse old bosses before the final boss, and I just hate that shit, man. Like, I get it, you made a cool looking boss, you made a cool feeling boss battle, but did you really have to use it again? Maybe you should have made the original fight more memorable and not be over in like a minute and 40 seconds because it's so fucking easy. If you're gonna do Ganon's tower, the way Ocarina does it is perfect, with doors leading to puzzle rooms with enemies in them. It honestly makes it feel like another real dungeon. With most Zelda games, within the first hour, you know what you're getting into in terms of flow. Ocarina of Time and most of the 2D Zelda games are very fast and gameplay reliant, but if you pick up something like Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword, you know things are going to get a little bit slower. Wind Waker, interestingly enough, isn't a consistent flow. It goes from slow to fast, back to slow. And the only reason it gets slow in those moments is because it's run out of things to show you. I hate to keep drawing the Ocarina of Time comparison, but I always consider the Tower of Gods the equivalent of the Temple of Time in Ocarina. A lot of the times in a Zelda game, when you get the Master Sword, it's like you've entered the real part of the game, and everything else before that was kind of like the introduction. So imagine getting the Master Sword in Ocarina of Time, and the rest of the game was weirdly paced with only 2 dungeons instead of 5. 6 if you include Ganon's Tower. Oddly enough, with Wind Waker, when you get the Master Sword, the game already feels like it's rushing to its conclusion. So of course you have the classic, great feeling 3D Zelda gameplay. Link always feels appropriately heavy in these games. I love the little moments like when you have to jump from platform to platform, but one of them is a little far away, so you have to pull yourself up. The combat is simple but effective in all of these games, and if you ever feel like it's not challenging or engaging enough, I really encourage you to skip out on some hearts that you get after a boss battle. Maybe do a 3-heart challenge, or maybe 5 or 6 heart challenge. I've done a 3-heart challenge in Ocarina, Majora, Wind Waker, and I think Minish Cap. I gotta go back and look at my save file. And limiting your health in these games makes the combat so much more exciting and challenging. It forces you to use all of your items rather than just the sword and shield. Except in Wind Waker. I don't know what happened during the development of this game. I don't know what conversations were had, but somewhere along the line the developers decided to make this game really fucking easy. Zelda 1 is kind of a hard game. Zelda 2 is definitely a hard game. A Link to the Past is kind of a tough game. When you get to the Dark World, you either have 7 or 8 hearts, and enemies can just swarm up to you and do 2.5 hearts of damage, killing you in seconds if you slip up or accidentally get stuck in a corner. There's also annoying ass bosses like Moldorm that can knock you down on floor, which replenishes his health, and even bosses where if you don't have enough ammo or magic for a certain item, you're shit out of luck and you have to die. Link's Awakening is the first game in the series that I think eliminates those annoying elements and creates a much more balanced game that may only show you the game over screen 2 to 3 times in a playthrough, which for a lot of people they'll say, oh, the game's too easy. I think this middle of the road difficulty is continued in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. But because those two games are firmly in the middle of the difficulty scale, you still may be encouraged to go get an extra bottle so you can have a fairy or a potion in it. Or maybe you want to go get an extra heart or 2 with the pieces you find in the world. Or like I said, you can do the opposite and stop at 3 hearts and make certain bosses or enemies like the Iron Knuckles in Ocarina so much fun to fight. But Wind Waker is just so unbelievably easy that during this most recent playthrough, I didn't get 1 optional bottle or 1 optional heart. And I think I used a fairy once, which means I would have died if I didn't have the fairy, but since I had it, I didn't die once in my whole playthrough. I just don't understand why this game is so easy, and I know the simple answer is, well, look at the art style. Clearly, it's trying to appeal to children. But here's the thing. The reason I find it so strange that the combat is so easy is that they actually tried to put some depth into it compared to its predecessors. There's a parrying mechanic, you can pick up enemies' weapons and use them against each other, you can even bring 10 Knight's Helms to your sword teacher and get an optional move like a super spin attack. So why even have this level of depth if the game never actually encourages you to explore it? Again, why have stealth elements if the game never uses them after the first 30 minutes? Imagine if instead you had a group of moblins and 1 Darknut, and the Darknut, instead of having a weak point on its back, could only be hit in the face through a small hole in its helmet, which means that you would have to defeat the moblins first, pick up their spear, and stab the Darknut with it. Something like that is encouraging the players to explore depth. I would actually argue that the game discourages you from using enemy weapons because they're often very heavy and slower to swing around, or they'll bounce off walls or pillars. The toughest enemy in this game, other than bosses, is the mighty Darknut, but even they're not that bad. Like I said before, I beat Wind Waker on hero mode with double damage and a 3-heart challenge on top of that, and it still wasn't that hard. To give you an example of how easy this game is, during the final dungeon, the Wind Temple, there's this central room with a giant fan that brings you up multiple levels, and I would just jump to the very bottom of this room from the very top because I would rather save magic than health, since even falling from those extreme heights only did a quarter or a half heart damage. It feels like either one of 2 things happened during development. They either just made the decision from the beginning to make almost every enemy and environmental hazard do next to no damage, or they just didn't have enough time to finely tune the damage each enemy will do to Link. This feels like playtest damage. It doesn't feel like, okay, let's ship the game damage. Either way, unfortunately, Wind Waker started a very odd trend for Zelda games, where even Twilight Princess, a game with a much more serious art style, is just as easy, if not easier, than Wind Waker. Let's be honest, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask are fairly easy games, but there are moments, enemies, and situations that can really screw up your playthrough for a while, especially for somebody playing through these games for the first time. But even if I close my eyes and try my hardest to forget the this is my 4th playthrough and I know Wind Waker very well. I can't imagine anybody, even on their first playthrough, really struggling. It feels like a contradiction in design to offer the player optional upgrades when the game truly does not need them. In A Link to the Past, you can maybe get 3 or 4 extra hearts and still have trouble beating the game, which makes exploring the world and unlocking the magic cape or the cane of Berna feel extra rewarding. Wind Waker encourages none of this. So there's not much new going on here. You already know about the bombs, bows and arrows, and hookshot. In terms of new stuff, we have the grappling hook, which I kind of like, but if I'm being honest, it's always bothered me a little bit that the hookshot and the grappling hook have the same use. They are both used to cross gaps or to bring enemies or items closer to Link. If you think about Dragon Roof's Cavern, you could actually replace the grappling hook poles with hookshot targets and it would have been the same dungeon. But in terms of new stuff, we also have the Deku Leaf, which I've always loved. I really enjoy that it has 2 uses, the paraglider from Breath of the Wild and the sailcloth from Skyward Sword, but it's also a giant fan which lets you solve puzzles and shoot a gust of wind at enemies. The Deku Leaf is definitely my favorite item in the game. I also want to shout out the boomerang here because even though I do think it kind of controls worse than it does in Ocarina of Time, it has a new multi-targeting system which is pretty awesome. So out of the 5 core dungeons, I really think the last 3 are great. Tower of the Gods gives off this holy, untouched atmosphere. It feels like nobody was ever supposed to be here. It's probably my favorite dungeon in the game. The Earth Temple has a lot going on for it, with the Mirror Shield and Medley, who feels like her own separate item. Then there's the Wind Temple, which I originally remembered as being the best dungeon because I loved how it incorporated the Deku Leaf, Iron Boots, and Hookshot. If there's one compliment I have to give every dungeon in this game except the first one, it's that they require the player to use multiple items, which is nice. For example, when you get the hookshot, you think, oh, maybe I can pull these heavy things off the walls. But it's not that easy, because Link is so light, the hookshot will just pull him towards the thing on the wall. So you have to equip the iron boots and then use the hookshot to pull the thing off the wall. But unfortunately, during this playthrough of the Wind Temple, Makar was kind of bugging me with how helpless he is. And he's not very useful for many puzzles, unlike Medley. He's good for like 2 or 3 moments throughout the entire dungeon. I really think part of a good Zelda dungeon is getting lost and staring at the map and trying to figure out where you're supposed to go next. These places are supposed to feel tricky and dangerous. And if we're going by that definition, I think the Earth Temple was the best dungeon for me during this playthrough. And for the first 2 dungeons, Dragon Roof's Cavern and Forest Haven, I have a huge soft spot for Dragon Roost. Just how fucking gorgeous the lava looks in this art style. It's pretty linear, but it's also cool how the dungeon requires you to go outside multiple times, culminating in a very good mini boss moment with Medley. But like I said before, the grappling hook could have just been the hook shot since they're both about crossing gaps. It's kind of like how in Ocarina, Kid Link has his slingshot and Adult Link has his bow and arrow. It's the same gameplay function, but I guess it's a little bit more excusable because they're trying to differentiate the 2 links. So lastly, we have the Forest Haven, which is the second dungeon, and it gets bonus points for being less than 20 minutes away from Dragon Roost, allowing us to just feast on that meat I was talking about earlier. It also gives us 2 items back to back, the Deku Leaf and the Boomerang, which is fucking awesome. But overall, this dungeon is nothing too special or tricky. It just felt too linear for me. And aesthetically, it's nice, but I like it a little bit less than Dragon Roost. So I'd probably do this for my ranking of the dungeons in Wind Waker. Number 1, Earth Temple, 9 out of 10. Number 2, Tower of the Gods, very close, also a 9 out of 10. The Wind Temple, decently complex, a little bit frustrating with its structure and with Makar, 8 out of 10. Dragon Roost Cavern, 7 out of 10, very beautiful dungeon, but very easy. Forest Haven, 6 out of 10, it's just very easy and it didn't make much of an impression on me. I also find it weird how we went from the Ice Cavern in Ocarina, which could probably take new players 15 to 20 minutes to finish, offering them the Iron Boots and Blue Fire, to just a single room offering boots and power bracelets in Wind Waker. There's really no mini dungeons in this game. They're more like micro dungeons. They're just one room. And clearly Ganon's Tower and the Ghost Ship should have been more than what they were. Especially the Ghost Ship, man. Chasing it is actually a really cool idea. For it to just be one simple puzzle room sucks. Oddly enough, I think this is where Wind Waker clicks with me the most lately. I love that this game is the closest thing we'll ever have to a sequel to Ocarina of Time, way more than Majora's Mask ever was. It's basically a post-apocalyptic Ocarina of Time Hyrule, where Ganondorf breaks free again and the only way the gods think of saving the people is by flooding the whole fucking world. I mean, they do warn them to climb to the tallest mountaintops, which will make them islands. When you walk into that Master Sword room and see the stained glass windows of all of the 7 sages that you rescued in Ocarina of Time, it's just, it's goosebumps. Unless it's like a super direct sequel or an Easter egg, Zelda games don't always reference each other. And I really love the whole theme of the game, which especially comes out at the end, which is basically, it's about letting go of the past and looking forward to the future with bright eyes. You would think from an outside point of view that Tetra is the secondary protagonist in this game, but after the 50% mark, she's not really in it until the very end. And let's be honest, again, the Zelda games never handled Link's companions very well. Navi is literally just a navigator who gets a bad reputation because of a stupid internet meme. She's really not that annoying. Tattle is just a quieter Navi. Midna is actually kind of cool, and Fi, looking back on it, was better than I thought. She was annoying, but it was actually part of her character. She's basically a computer who had to learn feelings. Anyway, I never really felt much when it came to the companion eventually leaving Link at the end of the game. And that still applies here with the King of Red Lions / Daphnis. Because the king is limited to the boat and the weird talking rock Link has that's, again, not used very often, you don't actually have to talk to him much in the game. So the goodbye scene at the end really fails to be emotional. But everything else about the ending just kicks ass, man. Especially the Ganondorf fight, and especially the conversation that Tetra has with Link and the king about them going off to find a new land to become the new Hyrule. And then when the king says that that new land will not be Hyrule, it will be theirs, whew, goosebumps. It's really cute, and it somehow feels like they jammed that whole message in at the very end of the game, and it worked. When the credits rolled, I got goosebumps. Goosebumps because every time I replay one of my favorite games and finish them, I get this sad, powerful feeling of like, wow, think of how much time has passed since I last saw these credits. Wow, when's the next time I'll want to see these credits? I mean, who knows, I could be like 35, 40 the next time I play Wind Waker all the way through. I was also a bit sad because as the time has passed, and again it's been a decade since I first played Wind Waker, my opinion has changed quite a bit. I really used to think that this game was a masterpiece, better than the rest of its series. I opened up this video by saying that it was my second favorite game ever, but now I see Wind Waker as a really good game that unfortunately had to cover some blemishes. It also started some pretty trends with the Zelda series. The game started to be way too easy starting with Wind Waker. And the Triforce quest started this stupid trend in Zelda games where the game likes to break its own flow by asking you to go find some crap, like the light vessels in Twilight Princess, or the bridge in Twilight Princess, or that thing in Skyward Sword I'm forgetting where you need that floaty robot with the hands. Do me a favor, imagine those games without that stuff. It wouldn't hurt them at all. It would actually make them way better. Imagine Wind Waker with a Jaboon dungeon and one more sage temple. I mean, fuck, I didn't even talk about the sages here. If you want to see how weird this game is compared to its predecessors, how did we go from 7 sages to only 2 in Wind Waker? It's also kind of a missed opportunity that they made new sages for this game. Like, I get that there's supposed to be descendants, but it would have been really impactful if they chose a couple from Ocarina of Time to come back in Wind Waker. I know a lot of this video has been me talking about the flaws I see in this game now, but I think I know why I felt so strongly about Wind Waker back in the day. Because when you're a quiet, sad kid who sees a game that looks like this, and sounds like this, and feels like this, yeah, it's a pretty damn beautiful game. In a lot of ways, in most ways, I will say that Wind Waker will always be an amazing game worth anybody's time. Yes, there's padding, yes, there's some tedious moments, yes, there's some half-baked gameplay mechanics, but for the main duration of your playthrough of Wind Waker, you're going to be having fun, and that's the whole point of a video game. I guess if I have to be a nerdy-ass game journalist and slap some numbers on this thing, which I already did in the dungeons section, so I guess I am a nerdy-ass game journalist. I used to see Wind Waker as a 10 out of 10. Now I see Wind Waker as like a very strong 8.5. I guess that's really all I have to say. So thank you to Wind Waker for all the beautiful memories, the beautiful moments, the amazing soundtrack, world, for getting me through that really hard time in my life. You will always be an important game to me. And thank you all for your time and for watching my video. And like I said earlier, if you like Nintendo, if you like Zelda, if you like video game analysis, if you love my beautiful, amazing audiobook worthy voice, please don't be afraid to subscribe, to like this video, to comment. I want to know your opinion on Wind Waker. Am I a clown? Is Wind Waker an 11 out of 10? Is it better than freaking The Godfather 2? Thank you.